hundreds of kilometers from the sea, hidden among the mountains of Anatolia, stood an unshakable fortress. It was home to the most powerful land army of the Bronze Age, the masters of the iron weapon. This was the Hittite Empire. So how did a mysterious force known as the Sea Peoples completely wipe this colossal land empire off the map? This is more than a collapse. This is the story of an evaporation, and it is the most brutal proof we have of just how fragile that Golden Age system truly was. Welcome to the Shard of History. Let's recall the three superpowers of the late Bronze Age: Egypt, the Mycenaeans, and the Hittites. Egypt was the brand. The Mycenaeans were the raider merchants. But the Hittites were the soldiers. They were the heavyweight champions of the system. Their military might was built on the superweapon of the age, the three-man heavy chariot. Unlike the light, two-man chariots of the Egyptians, the Hittite chariot was a mobile platform, a driver, a shield-bearer, and a spearman. This made them a slow but unstoppable force on the battlefield. They proved this power in one of the most famous battles in history, Kadesh. The Egyptian pharaoh, Ramesses II, carved this battle on his temple walls as a glorious victory, a masterpiece of propaganda. But we also have the treaty, and the Treaty of Kadesh is not a text dictated by a victor. It is a peace treaty signed between two equal powers. This proves that while Ramesses was lying to his people, the Hittites had fought him to a standstill and forced him to the negotiating table. The Hittites were co-authors of the game. Their capital, Hattusa, wasn't just a city. It was a fortress city. Enclosed by massive walls, far from the sea, it looked invincible. And they were political geniuses. They were the people of 1,000 gods. This didn't just mean they were pious. It meant they were politically smart. They didn't try to assimilate the peoples they conquered. Instead, they took their gods, brought them to the capital, and added them to their own pantheon. This was a brilliant way of saying to the conquered, "Your gods are with us now, so you are with us." It was a spiritual glue that held the empire together. The Hittites looked eternal, and then, around 1178 BCE, they were gone. But let's not understate that word. This wasn't a collapse, this was an evaporation. To understand this, think of Rome. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, what was left? The papacy was left. The Latin language remained. Its legal system, its architecture, its culture remained. Rome lived on as a ghost. When the Mycenaeans collapsed, the palaces burned, but the people fled to the hills. Their language, Greek, survived and returned after the Dark Age. Egypt was battered by the Sea Peoples, it was weakened, but it remained Egypt. When the Hittites collapsed, nothing was left. Their capital, Hattusa, that unshakable fortress, was burned in a fire so intense that it was never, not for a single day, resettled. Their language, their cuneiform script, their massive libraries of thousands of clay tablets, were forgotten. So much so that for thousands of years, until archaeologists rediscovered them in the 19th century, the very existence of the Hittites was considered a myth. They were mentioned in the Bible, but people assumed it was just a legend. So, what happened? How did the army that stopped Egypt at Kadesh evaporate against a band of Sea People marauders? How was this fortress, so far from the sea, destroyed by a naval threat? The answer lies in our Swiss watch metaphor. The answer is that the Hittites' greatest strength was also their most fatal weakness. The Hittites were a land empire, yes, but their economy was completely dependent on that globalized system. It was dependent on the sea. Remember the palace economy of the Hittites? That centralized structure where everything was collected at the palace. This system needed a constant flow of grain to feed its massive cities and armies. And the high plateau of Anatolia could not feed such a large population on its own. The climate was harsh, the land unforgiving. The Hittites were dependent on grain from Egypt and, even more importantly, from their ports in Syria like Ugarit. They even imported grain from the Black Sea, from the Ukrainian steppes. Those ports were the empire's gills. They were a land animal, but they needed the sea to breathe. So what did the sea peoples do when they arrived? They cut off the gills. We know of the last desperate clay tablet from the king of Ugarit, that rich Hittite port on the Syrian coast. The king was screaming for help. "The enemy ships are here. They are burning my cities." But who was he screaming to? The Hittite king. And where was the Hittite king? He had his own problems. Worse, Ugarit's own navy was gone, sent by the Hittite king to defend the Aegean coast. Ugarit was defenseless when the attack came. The sea peoples severed all of the Hittites' connections to the sea, and the Swiss watch stopped. When the grain ships stopped coming, the palace economy in Hattusa collapsed. And not just grain. Bronze. The army's weapons depended on that global trade network. When the tin from Afghanistan stopped, the army could not produce new weapons. The system froze. The interpretation is this. Before the sea peoples ever burned Hattusa, Hattusa was already starving. One of our last records is a plea from the Hittite king, begging the Egyptian pharaoh to send emergency grain shipments to save his life. The pharaoh of order sent grain out of mercy to the soldier king, but it was like giving aspirin to a dying empire. The archaeological proof is in the final ashen layer of Hattusa, in the tiny carbonized grains of wheat. This is the proof of the famine. The system had failed. And this brings us back to that darkest theory. Civil war. What did the starving population do to that palace of 1,000 gods? What did they do when that palace economy abandoned them? To the north of the Hittite heartland, there was a troublesome barbarian tribe called the Kashka. As long as the Hittites were strong, they kept the Kashka in check with money and soldiers. But what do mercenaries do when the money and grain run out? They turn on their masters. Was Hattusa burned only by the sea peoples from the outside? Or was the gate opened by the Hittite people themselves, starving, no longer believing in their king, and joined by the opportunistic Kashka warriors? This wasn't an invasion. It was a revolution. The final inscription of the last Hittite king, Shopilulima II, makes this tragedy even more ironic. In it, he boasts of a minor naval victory he won against the sea peoples off the coast of Cyprus. This is the portrait of a man bragging about weeding his garden while his house is on fire. The king was obsessed with a small symptom, unaware that his entire empire was rotting and collapsing from within. We said the sea peoples were a sledgehammer. But in the Hittites' case, that sledgehammer struck a wall that was already cracked from the inside, weakened by famine and had lost its central authority. This is why the blow was so fatal. This is why the empire completely disappeared. Others were shaken. The Hittites were shattered. All that was left of them was ash and the names of forgotten gods. The sea people's storm had claimed its first and largest victim. But that storm was not over. It had turned its eyes to the golden-masked kings of the Aegean, the pirate lords of Mycenae. Subscribe to the Shard of History. In our next episode, we go to the land of legends, Greece. Why did the Mycenaean palaces burn? And how did this collapse trigger one of the darkest dark ages in history?